My name is Dr. Danny Ald, and I'm very excited to invite you to our conversation here. For today's chat, we have Dr. Nicole Avina. She is a scientist, faculty member, and researcher who has published prolifically on many different areas of nutrition, in particular sugar addictions. So I'm very excited to have her introduce herself in a moment. Right now, just to share a little bit more about me, my background is that I'm an educational psychologist who came to the food and CPG world with my husband and co-founder David. We have a son, and when he was born 8 weeks premature in Honolulu, Hawaii, it was a very tense situation for us. But he was a fighter and a really strong warrior. So a native Hawaiian cultural practitioner gave him the middle name Kekoa, which means brave warrior in Hawaiian. When we got him home, we just weren't satisfied with the foods on the market. So we did our research and started making all of our own food for him and incorporated lots of vegetables and fruits, but also palate expanding herbs and spices to avoid adding sugars and sweeteners and to have him appreciate healthy food. We now share these recipes with the world through Keikoa Foods. And I'm just very excited to have Nicole here to kind of talk about her experiences and what are some of her concerns that she sees in terms of the foods that are out there and how we can incorporate better practices so that we can all be healthy eaters and raise healthy eaters. Dr. Nicole, if you would introduce yourself, please.
Well, thank you so much, Danny. That was great. I am so excited to be working with you guys and having these conversations because I feel like you and I have talked about these things so much and there's so much always to say, right? About, food and children and, what we can do to help our children grow and nourish themselves in the best way possible. And we know a lot of that starts off with, what they're eating when they're young, especially when they're babies. And so my area of interest and my area of expertise really is kind of developed around that. I started off doing a PhD in neuroscience, and I got interested in the brain and how food affects the brain. And that kind of led down this path for me of really just trying to understand from the standpoint of, how does food affect our brain in a negative way in the sense that, it causes us to want to overeat or eat a lot of processed foods or eat a lot of added sugar. But more recently, I've gotten interested in understanding, well, how can we capitalize on what we know about how food affects the brain and make positive changes in our behavior and make better choices around what we eat, especially when it comes to what we're feeding our kiddos. So for me, it's really been a bit of a journey from, the academic world of doing these experiments in the lab and publishing papers and writing books, to really now, as a mom myself, trying to help other parents and relate to the struggles that we go through because it isn't easy. And especially in our modern food environment where we have all of these different things kind of pulling our kids in different directions in terms of telling them what they should eat or should want to eat, what's really healthy is often, a challenge to kind of convey to them. So I'm excited to be talking about these things because I think a lot of people are in the same boat as us and really just kind of need the support and some guidance.
That is all amazing. It's very exciting too that you looked at the brain and how, food affects it and how we can make different changes. In all the time since you've been doing your research and discussing how different foods can affect the brain, I'm assuming that some parents have come up to you and mentioned that, their child is not the healthiest eater that they wish they could be, and they're seeking, some guidance at this stage. What are some things, or even one thing that you wish a parent knew from the beginning or did from the beginning, so that way they could put their child on the healthiest pathway going forward?
Well, I think one thing that often comes up is that, people, as parents, I think we do this a lot, right? We beat ourselves up about the stuff we didn't do right the first time. And so, I'll often hear from parents that they'll say, oh, I didn't know I was supposed to, you know, be more mindful about what I feed my kids. And, my first child now, doesn't eat vegetables. I'm better about it with the second one. But, what do I do about the first? And how do I, kind of fix this? And, my answer to people is always it's never too late. It's never too late. Even if you have a teenager who, is stubborn and, doesn't want to maybe make all these like health changes, it's never too late. You can always start to incorporate small changes that can amount over time to big differences. And so, one of the things I'll recommend to parents is really try to focus in on what healthy things your kids are eating, not so much focusing on, oh, these are the five things that I wish you didn't eat or I wish you didn't ask me to buy at the grocery store, but really kind of leaning into, if your child is asking, for fruit, or if there's a certain vegetable that they like cut up a certain way. I mean, really just kind of leaning into that, I think, can make a big difference. And then going from there and really expanding the conversation, using that as a launch point. And I think you'll find that kids, at least in my experience, they really like to do things when they think it was their idea. And you know it's really in your best interest to let them lead. And if you can show them, oh, I'm really proud of you because you're choosing to have blueberries instead of breakfast cereal, that's great. They're going to feed into that, and more and more behaviors like that will come along.
I think that's a really excellent point. Making sure the children are involved in the decisions and the choices, and then supporting them, and then having those conversations. With our son, we did try to talk about why vegetables are healthy and why he should be eating them. So I remember him being like 4 or 5 years old, and kind of almost like that the Popeye cartoon, from when I was a kid at least, and eat your spinach because it's really healthy for you. But I love the idea that it's never too late. And, how can we encourage the better choices and help our kids to, continue to make those choices? That's wonderful.
Yeah, one thing that is a little bit of a challenge, and I'm glad you brought up the Popeye commercial or the Popeye, cartoon, because I remember that as well. One of the, I think, challenges that we face with our kids is the fact that health is not something that you're going to immediately see the effects of. So, Popeye would eat the spinach and all of a sudden he'd have these giant muscles, right? And we know that that's not real life, that doesn't actually happen. And so I think, trying to get kids to understand, you need to eat these healthy foods because long term it's going to help you. It can be difficult for kids, depending on their age, to kind of grasp that concept. Everybody wants that immediate satisfaction. So, what I tend to try to do with my kids is, I have a teenager and then I have a fourth grader. So, I have a bit of a range of conversations that I'm having with people. But with the older one, I'll, kind of lean into more of the, long-term health and how this is going to help you with your cross country season. And, you're not going to get as tired when you're playing basketball, like all of the things that I know she's interested in that have more of a long-term effect. Whereas with my younger one, I do kind of have to lean to the, shorter term effects where, if you have a healthy breakfast, you're going to have tons of energy at recess and you're not going to be, lethargic because you didn't have a good breakfast. And so I think you do need to tailor the conversation to kind of have kids see the short term and the long term goals depending on where they are in terms of their developmental stage.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Our son is 11, and he's very active. And so I think the idea of like telling them about how food is energy and food will sustain you and allow you to do the activities that you want to do, and also prevent hunger, because we definitely witness that from time to time. And that kind of actually is a good segue to your focus of research, which is on sugar and sugar addiction. So would you share just a little bit about, what your concerns are about sugar consumption in this country? And the effects that it can have on us, as well as what your thoughts are on different kinds of sugars and sweeteners. Because I know that for many years now, the FDA is requiring that on the nutrition facts panel, we specify how many added sugars are included. So I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so there's a lot to say about sugar. I think, for me, the research that we've been doing in our lab and that others have been doing showing the addictive nature of sugar, it really gives pause. And, I think all parents should really be aware of this because, we wonder why our kids are struggling to pay attention in class, why they can't sit still, why they're misbehaving, why these behavioral issues come up. And I think a lot of it comes back to looking at their diet and looking at the amount of sugar that's in it. And most people don't realize how much added sugar is in their diet until they really sit down and start to look at those nutrition facts labels and write down the grams of sugar and look at the labels and see all the different forms of added sugar that are in many of the foods that, we assume to be healthy. I think a lot of people, know Yes, breakfast cereals have a lot of added sugar. Pancake syrup has a lot of added sugar. Obviously, these are things that have sugar, but there's a lot of hidden sugars that people are unaware of that find themselves in a lot of products that are healthy that we would assume to be good for us, like yogurts, for example. So you really do need to be pretty savvy when it comes to looking at sugar and trying to figure out how you can reduce it. And, one of the things from our research that I've been passionate about and trying to help people better understand is that, it's really a matter of making those changes and those small changes. It doesn't mean you have to like wake up and throw all the sugar out or throw everything in the pantry out the door that has any sugar in it. It's really about figuring out, where are these sources of added sugar in my diet and, what can I do to reduce them and hopefully eliminate them. So beverages is a big one, cutting back on the juice, cutting back on sodas, cutting out sodas and juice if you can at some point, is really great. And then just kind of systematically going through, your diet and your, pantry and your refrigerator and really just figuring out where are these sources of added sugar and how can you change that.
So in terms of added sugars, I know that some folks use stevia and some
Mhm.
other kinds of sweeteners. If they're saying that they're having kind of trouble with reducing sugar from soda or from juice, but they want to make that change, what do you think about incorporating some of these alternative sweeteners?
It's a question I get often, and my answer is that I think that they have a purpose. They could be a crutch for some individuals, but at the end of the day, our brain detects the sweetness. And so our brain doesn't know that these are artificial sweeteners or alternative sweeteners. Our brain just senses sweetness and expects the results of what we would get in nature that are sweet, so fruits are supposed to have fiber. Fruits are supposed to, release glucose in our blood and provide us with a quick source of energy. That's the way in which nature developed them, and that's the way in which our body processes them. But the problem nowadays is that with these artificial sweeteners and alternative sweeteners, our brain detects the sweet taste, but then it doesn't get what it expects. So we don't always get the rising glucose levels. We don't always get the calories. You don't always get the fiber. And so, really, these alternative sweeteners, they come across as being beneficial. And in some cases, they can be. If somebody just psychologically needs to use something that has one of these other sweeteners as a way to help them wean off of sugar, then I say, great, go for it. Use it as a crutch. But I think the end goal should really be to try to reduce our dependence on sweetness in general. Because ideally, we want to heal our brain and have our brain be able to function in a food society that isn't completely saturated with sweetness. And that's what we are essentially living with right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point because I think so many people think, okay, I'll use stevia instead of using, or drinking like that high fructose corn syrup or that added sugar beverage. And then now there's even more sugars. I know that your research, you've kind of looked at that. Like how many different kinds of sweeteners are there? Because I think people would be fascinated to hear it.
Yeah, it's hard to keep up, even, as a scientist who's looking at this information every day in and day out. I think it's over 350 different forms of added sugars, different
Wow.
names for added
Not to
sugar.
go
Yeah.
over it, but wow, 350.
It's
That's
a lot.
insane.
It's a lot. And, the average person, I don't know about you, but I don't have time to go to the grocery store and break out my list of 350 names for sugar and compare, it to the nutrition labels. Like nobody wants to do that. And so it can be a challenge. And another thing to keep in mind if you're looking to reduce the sweetness is that, we have the nutrition facts label that'll tell us how many grams of added sugar are in products, does not tell you how many grams of alternative sweeteners are in the products. It's only added sweeteners, added sugars, I should say. So if you're looking to cut back on stuff being overly sweet, you also need to know the names of these alternative sweeteners too, and you need to check the ingredients list to see if it contains any of those.
That makes it even more difficult than just memorizing the 350 added sugars that there are. Um, what are some of these types of sweeteners that are not included in the added sugar designation?
So, like you said, stevia is one. Any of these like sort of non-nutritive or zero calorie sweeteners like the sugar alcohols, for example, erythritol. Another one would be allulose. Allulose is a rare sugar, but it doesn't affect blood sugar in the same way as other sugars, and it doesn't have the calories that other sugars have. And so those are a few examples. Monk fruit is another example. And again, all these sweeteners are a little bit different in the sense of how many calories they have, how they affect our blood sugar level, how they taste. I mean, a lot of people will be able to, I know I'm personally a person that could taste. If you even brought something within 10 feet of me that had stevia in it, I could tell you because I can taste it. There's a certain taste to it. I can taste it. Other people can't. But it's really, one of those things where depending on the sweetener, it's going to have different properties. But like I said, at the end of the day, if the goal is to reduce our dependence on sweetness and that addiction to sugar that I think a lot of us are struggling with, it's really in our best interest to try to cut back on all of those sweeteners and really just try to retrain our palates and our kids' palates, especially to, enjoy the taste of spices, to enjoy the taste of vegetables, and not have everything have to be lathered with sweetness because it's really a basic psychological principle called negative contrast. And it's where if I were to say to you, Danny, I'm going to give you $20 after we're done talking, you'd be like excited, right? Oh, great, she's going to give me $20. And then if I gave you at the end of the conversation, I said, oh, actually, here's $5, you'd probably be a little disappointed, right? Because she said she was giving me $20. Why am I only getting five? Even though you're still plus $5, you're still going to look at it like, oh, it's not as great as the 20. That's what happens in our brain and our mouth when we eat foods, when we're used to having sugar. In the back of our mind, we're constantly thinking, oh, sugar, 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 oh, $20, $20, $20. And then when you get something that's not as great, your brain kind of defaults to thinking, oh, this isn't as great as the sugar would have been. And so we have to break that cycle. And the only way to do that is to really just cut back on where the added sugar is and where all the sweetness is.
That's a really great point. And yeah, I would be pissed if you only give me $5 after promising 20. Um, so what are some things that you would recommend if parents are looking for healthier snacks and they want to avoid the sugars and they want to make sure their children are getting more nutritious foods like that include those fibers? What are some specific things you would recommend for them?
Well, I put it to my kids and I really, again, I never ever utter the words, what do you want to eat? Right? Because that's just a license for them to tell me all the things that they know I don't want them to eat, right? But that they actually really do want to eat. But I'll usually offer three or four choices about, what do we have available for snacks? And then I let them pick. And I really think that's important because when kids feel like they're in control, then they're going to enjoy it more as opposed to, oh, mom or dad packed my lunch today and this is what they gave me. And I don't really like any of this or want any of this. So you really do need to let your children lead the way. And so, putting out things that you know are healthy, like, cut up fruits and vegetables, that kind of thing. And if your kids aren't big fans of those, then maybe saying, okay, well, what can we offer as like something that you could perhaps dip them in? So peanut butter or, some sort of salad dressing, hummus, having sort of a side part to the healthy snack can be a great way to kind of encourage your child to try it more. And then eventually maybe they'll have less of the side part and more of the main part of the healthy snack. I think that's a great option. And, really just kind of thinking outside of the box. One of the things that, we often talk about in my family and I talk about when I speak with other parents is this whole idea of how we've kind of fallen victim to these marketing traps with food. Breakfast cereal and breakfast foods don't have to be what breakfast is. You can have whatever you want for breakfast. It doesn't have to be this, short list of items that the food industry has designated as breakfast food, right? And so, if you want to have leftover dinner for breakfast, if it was healthy, that's great. So I think it's really about rethinking what the norms are around food. And the same goes for snacks. Snacks doesn't have to be a granola bar or, something that comes in like a snack form. Snack can be a mini version of, what we're going to have as a side for dinner and kind of just look at it through that lens and really I think just trying to be more creative and not so tied to these marketing traps is really what they are.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I did have a friend once ask her two boys what she what they wanted for dinner, and they said hamburgers, and she's like, I don't have hamburgers to make. And so then now she gets into this argument with both of them because they wanted to have, this special dinner that they thought they were going to be able to choose from. And so, yeah, she very quickly learned that it's more important to give them a few choices of what's actually an option as opposed to, tell me whatever you want to have tonight. And I think that's great what you said, right? Giving the children that autonomy to be involved and to help make the decision. And adding the dips as another option to make sure they're going to eat the healthier food. I think that's a great idea too. What we found is that we would introduce a vegetable to our son and, maybe try it with lemon juice one day, and then, he might like it that way or he may not. We've definitely utilized a lot of herbs and spices. I think my husband has more spices in our cabinet than the average family, but it kind of allowed us to, flavor things in different ways without adding those sugars or salts to the food. So I think that's a great idea. So I mean, we're kind of, coming on to like, a half an hour into the conversation. What is one other thing that you would love to share with parents based on your experiences, either as a mom or as a scientist, that you'd love for them to know and to incorporate into their parenting and how they're helping their kids become more nutritious, healthy eaters?
Well, one thing that came to mind when you were just talking about, the ways in which you guys have introduced, different flavors to your son, kind of leads me back to when we're talking about babies. And one thing that I think is important for parents to realize, and I wrote a lot about this in one of my books, it's called What to Feed Your Baby and Toddler, is this whole concept that you have to try to introduce new flavors to babies a lot before they're usually willing to accept them. And I think that that idea kind of goes against our instincts as parents, right? Because especially when we have this like beautiful 6-month-old baby that we're just starting to feed solid foods to, and we're like enamored by them, and we give them, let's say, the taste of peas, and they make this face of like, oh, like they don't like it. And I think as parents, we automatically default to caregiver making them feel better, and we say, "Oh, okay, they don't like that. Well, okay, let's try something else," and kind of stay away from the peas because they made a funny face in response to it. But really, the research shows that that face that babies are making, it's actually an innate response to a new taste. It's not a face of disgust. It's not a face of, oh gosh, mommy and daddy, how could you possibly ever give me that? You're terrible parents. No, it's really just the body's reaction to being aware of a new taste that isn't familiar. And it's actually an adaptive mechanism if you think about it, right? Because we want our babies to be aware and kind of a little wary of new tastes, because it could be protective if they are used to eating something and I've had this experience with my kids now that they're a little bit older, we've all had that experience where the milk was in the fridge a couple extra days too long, and then somebody takes a sip and says, "You know what? This milk doesn't taste right." Then we know, okay, there's something wrong. Let's throw this out. So we want our kids to kind of have that acute response to stuff that doesn't taste normal. And that's what's happening when they're first learning to eat. And so I think when we look at the research, it actually takes 10 times of exposure before babies are often willing to accept a new food. And so that might mean, you might have to try giving that food 10 different times, and the baby's maybe going to make that odd face 10 times. But at some point, they're going to learn, hey, you know what? This stuff didn't kill me. It actually doesn't taste that bad, so I'm going to eat it. But I think for a lot of parents, 10 times is a lot, right? And I think most of us give up after maybe 2 times and move on to something more palatable. But it's really worth it, and it's in your baby's best interest to keep at it and to keep offering those other tastes, because that's the only way that they're going to learn that those tastes are good for them, that they're safe, and that they have benefits.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. And it's interesting. I think so many people don't realize that it can take up to 10 times for a baby to receive a new food. I remember growing up, my parents, if we didn't eat the food on our plate, like or want to even try it, they kept encouraging us. And what they would say is your taste buds change over time. So maybe you can also speak to that because at the time I was thinking that, okay, when I hit this age, I'm suddenly going to love this broccoli or I'm suddenly going to love string beans more than I do today. Um, and I think, also growing up, I think a lot of parents, struggle with this where, like you mentioned, like my first child maybe was very receptive to vegetables. My second child is less receptive, but I didn't do anything different. So, what am I supposed to do here? But is there certain ages where foods are more receptive to children, or is it really just that exposure and just making them more familiar with it and helping them to understand what it feels like in the mouth and the response that the body has to it?
Well, there is a physical difference and there's a psychological difference. So physically, little kids live in very different sensory worlds than adults do, and even perhaps teenagers do. And so there's a reason why little kids like things to be really sweet and why they'll add sugar on top of sugar on top of sugar and sprinkles on the ice cream. And, it's almost like their threshold is much higher in terms of their preference for sweet. That's because it is, because they're biologically designed to prefer things that actually taste sweeter than what adults would prefer. So as we age, our our threshold goes down for what we consider to be the optimal sweetness. That's why if, you ever try to eat one of these like kitty cereals, as an adult, you're probably going to think they're pretty disgusting because they're just too sweet. They're almost aversive. But for kids, those companies are marketing towards kids in that century world where, they want it to be extra sweet. So we do have this sort of window where, our taste preferences are changing in terms of how we detect sweetness. And when that happens, when it starts to go down, it really opens the window for us to be able to accept other types of tastes and other types of flavors and textures. And it just changes things, I think, for the better in many cases. Now, one of the things that I think a lot of people struggle with is, figuring out, how do we navigate that, right? And I think part of the issue is that when kids prefer things that are really sweet, especially if we're talking like, feeding babies, a lot of times as parents we'll feed into that and offer fruits, so we'll have pureed fruit all the time, and that ends up being sort of the predominant source of food because babies like it because it tastes sweet and they're not making that aversive face in response to it. And so what I often tell parents is it's fine to give your baby pureed fruits, but you want that to come at the end of the meal, because if you start off with the fruits, everything else is going to taste like not that great because kids are used to the sweet taste. So you really want to save the fruit and the sweets for dessert and have it at the end of the meal and not lead with the fruit. That way, babies kind of work on that learning of these other tastes.
Yeah, I think it's really important to talk about it as learning. I think so often people think, oh, they just don't like this food because they don't like it, as opposed to no, they have to kind of get a little more accustomed to it. I mean, it's kind of very similar if your child wants to stay up late. It's of course they want to stay up late and have fun. There's, maybe some family members are visiting or, they want to watch another TV show. But we all know what happens when they stay up too late, right? That next morning we can't get them up for school or for whatever activities we have, and it just becomes a very unpleasant situation. And so it seems like with certain areas, parents kind of recognize that there's that learning process and that routine that needs to happen. But oftentimes with food, it seems like that doesn't seem to be the case. So I'm glad that you've mentioned so many practical options that people can think about, introducing the savory, healthy dinner meal first and then followed by the fruit. Did you
Yeah.
want to react to that?
No, I'm glad that you brought that up because it kind of reminds me of, you know, a lot of times I've heard many parents say this over the years, and I've heard kids say it too, like, oh, I don't eat that or I don't like that, and it's usually around vegetables, fruits, healthy things. Like, oh, my kid doesn't like that or they don't eat that. And I think, the choice of words is important because if you say that, especially in front of your child, you're almost giving them a license to not eat it and not have to try it and not learn to like it. And I think when you use those all or nothing terms, like they don't eat that or they don't like that, then you're closing the opportunity down for them to potentially learn to like it. So I like the idea of thinking of it as they're learning to like certain foods. And also, if you think about other, parenting things that we deal with, like telling your kids to go to bed, brushing your teeth. So if your kid balks at brushing their teeth, you would never say, "Oh, my kid doesn't brush their teeth. They don't like it."
Right. Yeah, you get a lot of funny looks if you just said, no, they don't do that.
Right. Same with taking a shower. There's a lot, we could go on and on. And again, I think it's, yeah, my kid doesn't like getting their hair washed, but they're learning to like it because that too bad they have to. And so
Right.
I think the same, we have to start to be that way with food. The reality is we know that a lot of our food environment is not healthy food. And so really kind of targeting those foods that we know are healthy and good for our child are the things that we need to help them learn to like. Just like as adults, you know, I don't remember loving broccoli when I was a kid or loving salad, but I became an adult and I realized, you know what? I got to learn to love this stuff because it's healthy for me. I feel good after I eat it, and I know that I'm going to have long-term benefits from it. And then yeah, you talk yourself into it and you start to enjoy it. And I think we have to allow our kids that same opportunity.
Yeah, I think that reinforcing of the positive behavior and, helping them to articulate how much better they feel when they eat a healthier meal as opposed to, how they might feel if they overindulged on the birthday cake at the party or, the ice cream as you were describing the ice cream with the sprinkles, I was imagining, this huge bowl with all these different toppings and then how somebody might feel when they're, 6 eating like an entire half gallon of ice cream with a ton of toppings on it. So I think that's really wonderful, right? Like to really think about how to get our kids and to think about why they should make different choices and why it's important and kind of scaffolding them along the way, right? Like giving that age appropriate messaging and as they get a little bit older, talking to them about the activities that they're involved in. Your daughter does lacrosse, our son does basketball, right? So if you're just loading up on these sugary beverages and foods, then you're going to really crash and not feel so good after, and then just crave more and more of it. So
Yeah, I agree. And I think, especially with our kids being a little bit older, and even for the younger ones, I really think it's important that the kids start to learn to police themselves when it comes to what kinds of things that they're going to eat. Because let's face it, we're not always going to be there, and we're not always going to be standing behind them, kind of looking at them when they're making the choice about what they're having at the birthday party or what they're having, at the school activity. And so I think that one of the best things you could do for your kid is to really talk to them about the why. You know, why do you only have one cupcake at Susie's birthday, even though Susie's mom said you can have as many as you want, right? And, explaining, those details, because I think a lot of kids, especially, the younger ones, they don't necessarily process like, well, why would Susie's mom want to hurt me? Like, not that Susie's mom wants to hurt them, but you know, why is it not a good idea to have three cupcakes, right? Why do we want to have one, enjoy it, and then that's enough? Like, really kind of teaching kids these things, because to be they're not innate. These are not innate types of behaviors. We live in a sensory world and a food world where our innate satiety signals are being completely overridden by the pleasure signals from all of the processed food that's out there. So if you're expecting your kid to just stop eating when they're full, it's not going to happen. If they're eating processed food, it's not going to happen, because that processed food has enough sugar in it to override any sort of satiety signal that could ever come from the food. So they're going to eat a lot more than they actually want and more than their body wants. So I think having those conversations with your child and, helping them to kind of see like, hey, if you eat a lot of this, it's going to hurt your belly. You're not going to feel as good later on. Have a little bit, enjoy it, and then, move on with the rest of the party, not focus on the food so much.
yeah, I think that's a really great message. All things in moderation. So, and helping our children to sort of monitor themselves because we want them to do that in all aspects, right? We want them to become, strong students who can kind of monitor their time and make sure they're doing their work as the teachers are assigning it and telling them to take care of it. It's the same thing with food, right? We want to moderate and not overdo it because it doesn't feel good. It really doesn't feel good at all.
It's true. And I think you're right. And you really did hit a nail on the head there when you're saying, it's just one of the things we're teaching them. And I think it does bleed into other areas. Like, for example, it made me think of my older daughter with studying. She's very studious. She wants to do well in school. But one of the things I admire about her, and I see it compared to her friends, is she's got a good sense of how much time she needs to devote to studying for things. And she's very good at partitioning her time to be able to accomplish all the things she needs to get done. And again, that's a skill that you kind of learn over time. And I think, again, making good food choices is another one of those skills, and understanding, okay, the long term consequences of me making a good choice in this situation are going to be beneficial. Whereas, if I go with my the pleasure part of my brain and just kind of throw all caution to the wind, then I'm going to be paying for it next couple days. So I do think it is a life lesson, but it has multiple lessons that kind of come along with it.
Well, Nicole, thank you so much for spending some time with me today and sharing with our listeners. This was really informative. It was definitely very science-based and educational. So thank you. Perhaps we can do this again sometime soon. What do you think?
Yeah, would be great.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.